Alright, so this is going to be the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system video. And basically in this one I just wanted to kind of clarify and explain in clearer terms, hopefully, the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. So what does this system do? The kidneys are tasked with one of the biggest things, or biggest jobs in the body. They have to maintain blood pressure, okay? And doing that is through the process of maintaining blood volume, okay? So if we decrease the amount of water in the blood, we're going to decrease blood pressure. If we increase the amount of water in the blood or fluid in the blood, we're going to increase blood pressure. So with that in mind, we can kind of think in a big picture, all of the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system is going to do is always going to be increasing in blood pressure, okay? So that's important to keep that kind of big view in mind, big to small, right? Big first. What does the RAAS system do? It's going to increase your blood pressure, all right? So with that said, we can get into the mechanisms by which it does that. So there are three big mechanisms, and there's one kind of apparatus that ties them all together, okay? So our apparatus here is called the juxtaglomerular apparatus. Big word, simple, simpler than it sounds, okay? So our juxtaglomerular apparatus is composed of our afferent and efferent arterioles. So you can see here I've got one drawn out, a juxtaglomerular apparatus. We've got our afferent arteriole coming in. So this is our arriving arteriole that's bringing blood in from our circulation. And it's going into the Bowman's capsule. And then we've got an efferent arteriole. So that's bringing blood out of the Bowman's capsule. Now in between these two arterioles, we're going to have some space that's filled up by just interstitial space. And then we're going to have our distal convoluted tubules, so that's part of our nephron, remember, running right through the middle of it. Okay, and that's by design, and it's very important. It's kind of an ingenious solution to a problem. So we've got our distal collecting duct, and right next to our distal collecting duct, we've got these cells that are highly specialized called our juxtaglomerular cells. It's right here. Thus the juxtaglomerular apparatus. It's all around the glomerulus. All right. So how does this system increase blood pressure? Well, first we've got to take we've got to know what our blood pressure is in order to increase it or to increase it if it needs increasing. Okay. So the way we do that is through three mechanisms that were touched on in class today. So we've got three ways of telling how much volume or how much fluid the kidney is filtering out, and then how much pressure is in our vessels at any given moment. Okay? So the way we tell how much water or how much solute or how much of anything is pushed through and filtered out through the kidney is through the distal collecting duct and these cells called the macula densa cells. All right, so a specialized part of the distal collecting duct has these cells lining the tubule, and they're going to sense the sodium levels in our distal collecting duct. Okay, so when our cells sense a concentration of salt that's outside the given norm, then it's going to trigger a response to compensate for that, okay? So I've kind of put a little bit of a cheat sheet here for us to kind of look at. So if our distal collecting duct is, say, hypotonic, that is, that we've got a decreased amount of salt in the distal collecting duct, that means we're going to have to go ahead and increase our blood pressure, right? So, how are we going to do that? Well, these specialized cells, these macula densa cells, are going to go ahead and signal to these juxtaglomerular cells, which are right next to it. So they're going to signal in a paracrine fashion which we touched on in our GI lecture. Paracrine meaning right next to. It's going to send a little paracrine messenger across that says, hey, we don't have enough salt in our distal convoluted tubule. And then the juxtaglomerular cells are going to go, oh shit, that's not good. We need more salt in there. We need to increase our glomerular filtration rate, or GFR, to get more salt in there, to push more of that salt out. And the way that we're going to do that is going to be through this enzyme, or you could also call it a hormone, of renin. So renin is just a molecule or an enzyme that's made by our juxtaglomerular cells, and it's going to serve to signal to increase, as we'll see, increase our glomerular filtration rate, okay? So as we have salt, or as we have the renin being secreted because of our decreased level of salt, our juxtaglomerular cells throw a bunch of renin into our afferent arteriole. They secrete it in there because they're right next to it. And when they secrete a bunch of it in there, it's going to carry it throughout the body. And in the body, we have in our liver a protein called angiotensinogen. Angiotensinogen is going to be acted upon by renin, which is secreted from the juxtaglomerular cells, so that it can be turned into angiotensin 1. Okay, and angiotensin 1 is going to circulate in the blood again once it's released from the liver after it's been activated by renin. And it's going to get converted in the lungs through this angiotensin converting enzyme. And this angiotensin converting enzyme is going to make it into this fancy molecule called angiotensinogen, or angiotensin 2. And angiotensin 2 is going to actually do our things that we want to do to compensate for this decrease in salt in the distal convoluted tubule. All right, so it's going to influence, or the first thing that it's going to do is it's a potent vasoconstrictor, okay? So a potent vasoconstrictor, how do we increase or decrease glomerular filtration rate? We touched on this before in our kidney lectures. We do it by either vasoconstricting or vasodilating our afferent or efferent arterioles, okay? So since we know that angiotensin 2 is a potent vasoconstrictor, what we're going to learn is that our efferent arteriole is really responsive to these hormones produced by the renin angiotensin aldosterone system. So it's really sensitive to angiotensin 2. So what it's going to do is it's going to vasoconstrict. So it's going to get a smaller diameter, okay? That's going to increase the pressure because we've got the same amount, or if we want to think about it this way, we could even say that it vasodilates the afferent arteriole. So we got a bunch of fluid pouring into this mess of capillaries up here in the Bowman's capsule. We got a tiny little garden hose for all that fluid to get out. So what's that going to do? We've got a lot of blood trying to get out a little pipe. It's going to increase the pressure of the Bowman's capsule and thus increase our glomerular filtration rate, okay? All right, so we got that. All right, what about the opposite? What about if the distal convoluted tubule has an increase in sodium detected in it? Well, that's going to make the macula densa cells freak out again and go, what the hell? Not in our range of homeostasis. We're going to release a little paracrine messenger to our juxtaglomerular cells, but instead of telling them to release renin, we're going to tell them to not release it. We're going to inhibit it. And when the efferent arteriole doesn't have angiotensin 2 acting upon it, it's going to vasodilate. So it's going to increase. Okay? It's going to increase its diameter. So we're going to go from this to this. And what's that going to do? It's going to decrease the pressure in the Bowman's capsule, okay? And thus, it's going to decrease glomerular filtration rate, all right? So what happens with that? Oops, excuse me, I need to take a sip of water here. All right, so what happens with that? We increase our blood pressure, okay? So we can either detect a decrease in sodium in the distal convoluted tubule. So why might that happen? Well, if we have less volume of blood for one, say we're undergoing a hemorrhagic event, so we're bleeding out, we're not going to have as much filtrate in our kidneys because there's not going to be as much blood pouring into the Bowman's capsule, and our glomerular filtration rate is going to be pretty low, okay? So to counteract that, we're going to go ahead and go through this mechanism. Now, if our glomerular filtration rate is too high, we're going to have too much salt in our distal convoluted tubule because the pressure is going to be so great in the Bowman's capsule that so much salt is going to be filtered out through it that it's going to be outside of the homeostatic range. And thus, we need to decrease our glomerular filtration rate and inhibit renin release so we can inhibit angiotensin II in order to go ahead and decrease our glomerular filtration rate, okay? All right, so the other thing that I gotta mention with this is aldosterone. So aldosterone is a hormone that's secreted by the adrenal cortex. So those are, the adrenal glands are just sitting on top of the kidneys, and the cortex is the outer portion of it. Angiotensin II, before it reaches the afferent arteriole and does its thing, it's going to also influence the secretion of aldosterone. So an increase in angiotensin II, which is caused by an increase in renin, is also going to cause an increase in aldosterone. So what does aldosterone do? Okay, aldosterone, that is going to act on our distal convoluted tubule and our collecting duct. Okay, and we're going to increase our reabsorption of sodium from that. So when I think of aldosterone, I think of salt retention. So aldosterone makes us retain salt because in the distal, or not in the distal, but the collecting duct, which is our final kind of portion of our nephron, it's going to influence us to reabsorb more of the salt in our urine, or out of our urine, okay? So you can imagine that this is going to increase the effects of angiotensin II. So we're going to make a very small amount of urine when this system is active, okay? Because we're going to be retaining a bunch of water to increase our blood pressure, right? So we're coming full circle, thinking about it again. Our increasing amount of water or serum or plasma in the blood, we're increasing our blood pressure. So if we have our angiotensin II and it is being influenced by our renin secretion, and we increase our glomerular filtration rate, we are going to also go ahead and we're also going to go ahead and retain more sodium at the end, and we're going to thus make a really small amount of urine that is very concentrated, okay? So, simple enough, right? Hopefully that makes sense. All right, so the other thing that can influence these renin secretions from our juxtaglomerular cells is our beta-1 sympathetic receptors, or our beta-1 receptors, which are expressed on the surface of juxtaglomerular cells. So we've got a sympathetic nerve here that is going to release a neurotransmitter, norepinephrine. Remember that? Remember from my videos? Okay. And we know that beta 1 also increases your blood pressure, so this is one of the ways that it's going to work. It is going to influence our juxtaglomerular cells to secrete renin so that it can go ahead and go through all these different mechanisms of angiotensinogen and angiotensin 1 and angiotensin 2 and aldosterone to make us retain more fluid and increase our blood pressure. Okay, so that's the name of the game here. Retaining more fluid to increase our blood pressure. All right. Our third way we can influence our secretion of renin through our juxtaglomerular cells is with our baroreceptors in the afferent arteriole. So if our blood is constantly pushing against our walls of our afferent arteriole, and if they're collapsing down, that means that we don't have enough volume in our blood to stimulate the baroreceptors. So they sense that. So they sense the pressure. That's what baro means, right? And when you don't have enough pressure pushing against those receptors, they're going to influence the secretion of renin as well. And that is also going to increase our blood pressure or engage these compensatory mechanisms that are going to increase our blood pressure, right? All right, so simple enough, right? All right. What do I think here? What do I gotta say? All right, our BNP, B-type natriuretic peptide. This is our antagonist to this entire system. So the entire system I just described is serving to increase our blood pressure. What happens if we have a really high blood pressure, right? Well, we can't have a diuretic like we use in medicine to make somebody pee off some of their fluid. So our body has its own diuretic. And that's what I want you to think of natriuretic peptide as. In medicine, we often, in the ER and in cardiology, they often use B-type natriuretic peptide. It's just another type of natriuretic peptide. It's secreted by the heart or in the aortic arch when, and in this case I think it's the lungs, when blood pressure is too high. And what's this going to do? It's going to do the exact opposite of the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, all right? So it's an antagonist to it, so it's going to inhibit our reabsorption of NaCl. So like I said, aldosterone increases our reabsorption in the collecting duct of sodium. This is going to block it. So we're going to get a large amount of dilute urine, okay? It's also going to inhibit antidiuretic hormone. So we know antidiuretic hormone is responsible for the amount of aquaporins in the distal collecting duct. So if sodium can't get back into the kidney, it stays in the collecting duct. Water can't get back through to the salty kidney, it stays in the collecting duct. We make a large amount of dilute urine. So we decrease the amount of water reabsorbed, and thus we're going to decrease our blood pressure. All right? So, I hope that makes sense. Let me think. Yeah, I hope that makes sense.